For our next panel, it is going to be on information and data integrity, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Amelia Gardner. She is a county commissioner in Utah County. Now, Amelia is a blockchain and technology advocate who spearheaded the first application of blockchain in a national presidential election in Utah County. Amelia.
I have a co-moderator today. She promises she'll be good. So I've been on the road a lot, and she's missed me, so she wanted to be with me. Why don't you come up? And we're going to have three panelists today. It's our three distinguished gentlemen here. What we're going to be talking about today is document and data integrity. And we've asked all three of these gentlemen because one of the issues that we face in today's world. We live in a world where deep fakes are possible, and we really can't rely on the media to tell us what's real and what's not. We find these circles where somebody misquotes somebody else, and then a newspaper quotes the misquote, and then somebody quotes the newspaper, and all of a sudden digital data is really confusing and nobody knows whether it's real or not. So we're going to look at how do we use blockchain to solve the data integrity issue of our era, and that is information in the digital world. Is it accurate? We're going to start by having each of these folks introduce themselves, 2 minutes or less, if you don't mind, and we'll start right here to my left.
All right. My name is Wen Zhu. I'm the chief architect of NIRA and IRA. We're an IT consulting company in the DC area. So I guess talk about getting into blockchain area. This morning and last night, I saw a lot of visionaries, including Scott, and really impressed here. But I think I come from a different background. I didn't come here as get a blockchain as a really technology visionary for revolutionizing the decentralized world. Really, I can probably become my background as as somebody who solved a problem for customers to address a problem. Right? The problem we're addressing is how do you ensure the distribution of a document within a community? In our case, one of the DoD communities is secure. How do you ensure the documents are protected and authenticated and integrities are verified? That is how I get to know this world, and blockchain seems to be a natural solution, technology infrastructure for that kind of use case, if you will. So hoping to address more about that, and please feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you, Wen. George?
Well, I think you've all just heard my pitch, but I'll refresh it for anyone who wasn't in the room. George Farmer, CEO of Parliament Technologies, which is best known for owning the Parler brand, as well as a large-scale data center and cloud hosting provider. We've done a lot of work with Solana, and we've pioneered some very interesting stuff in the blockchain space and the NFT space. I guess in a very quick synopsis of how that links into data integrity, that kind of links back to what I was just talking about in the previous panel, which is the removal of an institution from governance of that data. We obviously have been subject to what I describe as a highly partisan attack on our business, which happened a year and a half ago. There was a malevolent actor which breached our security at the time when we were deplatformed and scraped a lot of data. How can we prevent that happening? We can move that data into a secure environment, which is the blockchain, and we can lock that data up, in an immutable record. So for me, data integrity is core to my business. My business is free speech and privacy and data integrity. So those are the kind of areas that we focus on as a company. So that's kind of how this links into what we're doing.
Oh, Michael?
It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be here. Even can you guys hear me?
We can hear
okay?
you.
Okay. It's wonderful to be here, even if it's just two in a row. So I'll be quick. Again, Michael Proper. I actually I've been in the industry for 26 plus years, building centralization for 13 of those years and decentralization for the last 13. Have built many different Clear companies. One's called Clear Cellular that builds secure communication at the mobile phone layer. One is called Clear Center that builds secure decentralized storage. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise pre-installs it and ships it around the world. And there's almost 450,000 deployments of that back end. So it's a combination of that back end with a front end that creates an ecosystem where this model can actually thrive. When I say this model, I'm talking about decentralization can thrive. The digital world is really where we can all join together. I'm a member, just one member, just each one of you can be a member of this digital world. And this digital world can actually prove the individual, prove the company, prove the assets, but it does it with the individual storing their own data. And so when they own their own data, they can share their data, they can pull their data back. And not only that, but if you lose your phone or your data, your systems, you literally put in a cryptographic key, put your fingerprint on it, and all your data comes back. And you're the only one that can actually access it. Yeah. And it's never stored in one location.
That's a great point. So when we look at data integrity, historically, for the last probably 2,000 years, there have been two entities that we've relied on to verify information and data. And those two entities are either a church, religion, or the government. So going back to basically the nexus of society, if people wanted to prove information, they wanted to prove that a piece of paper had monetary value, i.e. money, or if they wanted to prove who they were, their lineage, a birth certificate, they utilized either church records or government records. So this is where I look at this from the government standpoint, is I feel like we as a society are getting to a point where we can move beyond that, and I think that blockchain can help us do that. The interesting thing is that in 1991, when Stuart Haber and Scott Stornetta created the first blockchain, the reason they created that blockchain was so that they could solve the issue of data integrity on digital data. And so here we sit 30 years later, and many of us met and spoke with Scott Stornetta last night. 30 years later, we still have, I think one of the #1 issues facing our society is whether or not we can verify if digital data is accurate. So I would like each of you to address, how do you feel that blockchain can fulfill its original purpose of ensuring the data integrity of digital data? And we'll start with Michael and go down.
So if you take a photo, like I just snapped a photo, that photo can break into thousands of pieces and be stored in thousands of locations, and I'm the only one that can actually pull it back. That is decentralization. That is what I believe what Scott and others had a true intention of being able to create. And when we talk about church, when we talk about governments, it really should be about the individual. The individual being able to control that data coming back to themselves. So let's fast forward 5 generations from now and see if I want to, or let's say if I were to go back 5 generations, what if I wanted to know about a great-great-grandfather? What was he like? What did he do? What was, in this new world, imagine 5 generations from now, data. And it's not just a photo, but what about health? What about identity? What about who we are, where we've been, where we're, you can kind of tell the future based upon the past, but we have choices. And information can affect those choices. So it's massively important, I believe, for decentralization to be realized now. 30 years ago is when it was written. Now is a time where it can actually be facilitated. It's no longer a theory, it's real. That photo that I took really can break into thousands of different bits and then pull back. And what's beautiful is the first test that was done, when it was coming back, we actually shut down the connection. And you saw half of a photo being pulled back. And then when you, and I know that may not make sense to most of you, but it was so beautiful. So imagine a photo that you take, and then it gets pushed into storage that's decentralized. And then when they want to pull it back, and it stops, half of it comes back, which means you can also pull the data back. So let's say that you're with a physician and you want to share an x-ray. You can share it with a physician, We call HIPAA, Health Information Portability and Privacy Act, something that is actually used. Technology has not allowed it to use it. Why? Because the vendors that make money on it in the insurance and other ecosystems, where there's mystery, there's margin. My point is literally, it's by design.
You know, that's
But-
interesting, the point you make about not knowing, information that's because it's not decentralized, because it is centralized. I have a real world example of that. I'm a member of Daughters of the American Revolution, and my ancestor that qualifies me for that is a man named William Starr. He was a lieutenant in the Continental Army out of Connecticut. And I've known this for years, but I just this week went to Constitution Hall here in Washington, D.C., looked up a book in their library on William Starr, and learned that in one of the battles, he was actually shot in the chest. It hit his chest, his breastbone, traveled under his skin, through down his arm, and a surgeon removed the bullet from his elbow. And then 2 generations later, his grandson, not knowing the significance of the bullet in his grandfather's armoire, took that bullet, used it as a sinker for a fishing line, and lost the bullet while he was fishing. Now, how cool is that story for my grandchildren, right? But the only place that that story exists today is in a book that was printed in 1866 that happens to be in the library at Constitution Hall about 3 blocks from here, right? But with decentralization, we can bring that information and we can pass that information on, right? So I suppose what that means is that my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was willing to take a bullet for this nation. The least I can do is implement blockchain and take the figurative arrows in the process. So George, why don't...
Is it ironic that you talk about the American Revolution before you ask a British guy called George?
It's okay. After we duel at the flagpole and I win, we can still be friends.
It's okay, we've moved on now, it's fine, don't worry. I think it's interesting that we mentioned the church. I'm a student of theology, and philosophy is a lot of the tech guys who run companies, they kind of move past thinking about extraordinary wealth and they start to think about what the meaning of life is. And I'm definitely not in that category, just to be clear, but I definitely think about how we can as a human race prosper more. I was reminded when you were talking about the arbiters of truth, which was the church and the government, like John Henry Cardinal Newman famously said, one of the reasons that he converted to Catholicism was because he read the phrase that the church in and of itself is its own truth, right? And I'm paraphrasing there, so don't go fact check me on it. But basically that was the quote that he read, and he was kind of convinced of this. In some ways, the blockchain is in and of itself its own truth, right? And this is how it is relevant to human society and human interaction, because data integrity, that story is a great example. How can we preserve truth from generation to generation in an immutable fashion, right? And this is kind of what the blockchain enables us to do. It enables each individual to become its own node. It enables each individual to become its own storage point of data for the next generation. This is why I think that the rewriting of history happens the whole time. I mean, we talk about data integrity. We talk about how do we perceive historical fact. Historical fact is in some ways what Michael talked about earlier. Is the perception of historical fact is subjective, right? We all look at it and we all look at the data differently. How can we preserve that individual piece of data to be viewed by each generation in a different fashion, in a subjective fashion? We preserve it through the blockchain. So that's kind of why I think that data integrity, particularly when it comes to historical record, is going to become more and more relevant for not just Web 3, but Web 4, Web 5, whatever version of web we're looking at in 100 years' time. We want this conversation right now to be recorded on the blockchain so that in 100 years' time they can say, oh, these guys were saying the same thing as we are. Or somebody else disagrees, and then they can argue about it.
Wen?
All right, thank you. Before I answer your question, Amelia, I just want to tag on what Michael just said, because when he mentioned that all the pieces of picture coming together in such a beautiful way, I think I totally relate to that. Because one thing we're doing here is to improve the resiliency of enterprise data, and one way to do this is to distribute the data. right? I mean, you talk about cloud, there's still everything under a single IT administration, and one of the problem is if that IT administration's password is compromised, you're toasted, right? So now by distributing the data across different organizations, different blockchain nodes, you're actually addressing that problem. So it is beautiful to see all the data coming together in pieces to actually reconstitute the data and the document you have here. But going back to the question, Amelia, I agree with what George and Michael are saying. I think one of the key things that's different today is decentralization infrastructure. Now, you mentioned church, you mentioned government. I'm going to take a different route because I'm not going to say, don't trust them, because whether you trust them is your problem, right? But the problem we always had in the last 30 years, if I have to say, is there an easy way to verify with that authority you trust? There isn't, because what do we do with document? We hand you a piece of paper, right? And in an email, we put an attachment and send to you. How can verification happen in that kind of decentralized scenario? There's no easy way to do that. And the infrastructure of blockchain today actually gives the infrastructure to allow you to, the beauty of blockchain and execution of smart contract in such a distributed way, allow that to happen in a way that's closer to you. And I would say even closer than a server, because one of the things that we really need to do here with decentralization is we don't really, when sharing, going back to my document sharing world, there are ways to ensure integrity document. You can pass an URL, and that could point to a location there, but we don't do that. Nobody does that kind of sharing. All we do is we put a PDF in our email attachment and send to my colleagues. That's what we do. So we have to make sure that that kind of, whatever infrastructure we do, support that, which means we have to be able to do a lot of things in a more distributed, more local way to support that kind of integrity verification, authentication verification. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, that leads me into the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that is, when you think of your identity documents, if your birth certificate was issued to you by a government, your marriage certificate was issued to you by a government, your driver's license was issued to you by a government, your passport was issued to you by a government. You have very few identity documents today that are issued to you in any other way other than a government, or even you can change your name utilizing a baptismal certificate. So it's almost like today, 2,000 years later, we're still relying on government and religion for these identity documents. Now, I know that a lot of us look at the concept of self-sovereign identity, and Michael, you talked about identity, but I don't think we're quite in a world where self-sovereign identity is really a thing yet, at least not one that other people will accept. You can't go to the bank and utilize your self-sovereign ID to get access to your bank account. They want to see some form of a government ID. So we in Utah County have started this incremental process of bridging that gap you talked about a PDF, when you talked about the PDF that's attached to that document. Well, we have about 30,000 marriage certificates that have a blockchain sealed digital hash. And so if you get married in our county, we mail you the super cute paper copy that's folded and put in the envelope that has like the pretty ink and the seal. However, we also email you a PDF, and that PDF has a hash, and that hash is registered on the Ethereum blockchain. And then if I send that digital document to my bank so that they can change my name with my marriage certificate, the bank can then verify two things. Number one, they can verify that that document has not been altered. And number two, they can verify that the organization that registered that document is the government of Utah County. So we still have government verification, but we also now have a digital document that, by the way, you have access to at any time. You don't have to ask the government's permission if you lose the paper copy. So On that same note, how do you see that we can use incrementalism by using these little baby steps to get to the point that maybe we're no longer relying on government or religion for all of our documents, that we can actually get to the place that we own those documents as individuals and have that sovereign ID, but there is that step of incrementalization. I would like to know your thoughts on that, and we'll start with Wen.
I think the key issue here is trust. In the blockchain world, decentralized world, the issue of trust is very important. I'll give another example here. I mean, I think yesterday a lot of people talk about supply chain, right? Now, one of the supply chain problems we can think about is, well, if I'm buying, I guess I'm buying this microphone from somebody who bought this from somebody, how do I, get to that ultimate source for this? And you have the same issue with information as well, right? I mean, that information goes through a source, a chain of event that happens to Amelia passed information to me and it passed to George. That chain of event really depends on the trust at each step here, even though I have no relationship with direct relationship with Amelia in that case. So I think that the key thing is really establishing and measure and verify that trust. It requires technical infrastructure. I think the technical infrastructure is being really established, as you mentioned, the verifiable credential, the decentralized identification, identity management system. All that infrastructure is being built to actually allow that kind of infrastructure level to happen. But I think still we need to, at the next level, to figure out at a business and level what the trust relationship is between various entities, like Utah County government and myself, and somehow establish that, and like you're saying, Amelia, publish that on a blockchain so that people can understand and verify that kind of trust, and ultimately be able to get to trust the document that's being presented here.
Yeah, George?
Yeah, I mean, I want to latch onto that point as well. I think that Wen's absolutely right. I mean, there's a trust issue, and there's a what I'm going to call a control issue. No pun intended, really, in many ways. But the first is what he just mentioned, which is that consumers as a whole do not yet trust the digital infrastructure that is being provided to them, right? And there's a huge education barrier to overcome there. You've seen this with voting, for example. Like, this is one big issue. Like, I posted a photo of myself speaking about voting in the blockchain from NFT Expoverse in Los Angeles, and the overwhelming response I got from all of the people underneath was, just another way for the government to control us, right? Just another way for just another way for the digital infrastructure to be controlled by somebody, right? And that's kind of the perception that a lot of the blockchain has. And of course, with the crypto market collapsing this year, now you've seen everybody kind of come out the woodwork and criticize the infrastructure. And it's like, guys, this happens the whole time. Like, it happened with tulips. It's like every market goes through turbulence. It's nonsense to say that you can't have turbulent markets and yet have a reliable infrastructure which governs it. So there's a huge education barrier to overcome when it comes to civic engagement in blockchain. The second is, of course, the control aspect. And I commend you what you've done in Utah. There's no way the government wants to just give up control of your digital identity, right? This is the whole point. How does government, politics 101, how does government control anything? It controls it by the fiat use of force and the fiat use of currency, right? And those are the two methodologies that all governments harness to themselves. What does blockchain allow? It takes away one of their biggest weaponizations of control, which is currency, right? So it threatens that monopoly. And that's the reason that it has been embraced by so many people, because it offers an alternative to centralized currency, right? So if we are to innovate in this area, and we're trying to get people to embrace this technology, we need to continue to pitch to governments that this is a complementarity. It can be an ally in allowing for free expression. And to do that, we need to have, again, I come back to what I said in the earlier panel, which is we need to have politicians who understand this industry. You cannot just have, no offense to any octogenarians in the room, but like octogenarian senators saying, like, we can't have El Salvador embracing Bitcoin. It's just nonsense, right? That kind of legislation does so much damage, both to Congress because it makes them look completely outdated, and it also makes them not looking future-facing. Like, the blockchain is the future. There's just no doubt about it. In 100 years' time, it will be widely embraced by the whole of society across the whole world. To regulate it out of existence or to think that you can even try and do that is an absolute nonsense. So we need to have politicians who are embracing this. Commendations to yourself and to other politicians who have done this. And we're seeing more and more of this happen. Like this electoral cycle, there will be more pro-crypto candidates than any other electoral cycle. That's not surprising, given the fact that every year this industry is evolving. And that goes hand in hand with the first point, which is the trust.
That's when I was talking about the figurative arrows that I take, absolutely. I mean, there was literally my competitor my opponent in the primary election this year literally sent out a hit piece, spent $20,000 sending out a mailer that listed all the things I've done in blockchain. And it was supposed to be a hit piece. And I received a call from a friend, and they were like, is all of this true? And there were like 10 bullet points on it. And way too much information for a mailer anyway, but that's another story. So, and I said, well, 8 of them are true and 2 of them are lies. And they're like, well, which 8 are true? And it was like all the blockchain things and all the technology and innovation things. And they were like, these are all the reasons I am voting for you. Right, so I guess the moral of that story is if you find someone running for office that understands blockchain and understands crypto, don't just like smile and be happy, actually go out and support that person. Because I can promise you we are taking arrows. Michael?
I think the point that you're driving at around trust is massive. You as a mother with your daughter here, you signed a document for her when she was born. A birth certificate. Mm-hmm. Did you know, most of us, as a mother, the mother that gave birth to that daughter, you know what you're called on that birth certificate? They call you an informant. You're a third-party validator, even though you're a part of that equation of giving birth.
Yeah, I'm verifying that I actually delivered that child.
Yeah. And so think about it. If we can actually have informants in our lives, maybe it's where money comes from, maybe it's where education comes from, maybe it's where life comes from, and those things validate who we are. Isn't that more validating than a centralized credit system? Maybe Equifax, TransUnion, Experian, that centralize our data, and then our data can be subject to compromise. That's one part of it. The other part of it is what you're talking about with the reviews, like this hit piece that this individual ran on you. I don't know why people would even stifle someone like Amelia. They care, they understand, and they're willing to commit their time to take those arrows. But think about it on a different role. For instance, there's a product that we're affiliated with that went live about a year ago. This product had more bad reviews within the first month, and no one had actually ever touched one of the devices. But you had people that would fictitiously say, I actually have the device right here, it doesn't do this, it does do this, it's based on this. Had no idea. To this day, if you look up that phone, Freedom Phone, you will find these negative reviews. But once the product starts shipping, all of them go away. So the point is you cannot trust the current infrastructure today. How many of you make product decisions based upon reviews? I would say that's probably one of the most, when you make a deciding factor around product, it's around reviews, right? How can you trust those reviews? Because nowadays they're actually paying for folks. They're not validated even purchasing the product. So in the digital world, you can actually build a reputation around a product, around an asset, around a business, around an individual, and they're cryptographically guaranteed. So trust and reviews are massive, massive pieces of the future. And I think the prior question that one of the 2 last individuals, I mean, it was so perfect. It's exactly what it's all about, trust and review.
We only have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to do 2 questions that are lightning round. We're going to do one and give you about a minute each, and then we'll do a second one about a minute each. The first one is, what do you think, if you could say just the one thing that is most important around document and data integrity that you would like this crowd to know? So 1 minute, what is the most important thing that you would like this crowd to know about document and data integrity and how the blockchain helps us with that? We'll start with Wen.
All right. I'll probably give a little bit unconventional answer here. I think, the title of this panel is Document and Information Integrity. But I really think you have to look at the actual use case you're trying to solve, the actual problem you're trying to solve. Different document will have different way and different needs to be authenticated and verified. Talking about birth certificate and marriage certificate, that probably be different than something I've been dealing with, like scientific paper or scientific data set, right? So I think those requirements are different. So I'm going back to the question. I think blockchain, by having the decentralized infrastructure, by having the framework for establishing trust between parties, by having the node that close to the end user, the end application, give you that whole infrastructure. You can build solutions for assuring data and information integrity, but it is really up to that application, that use case, that really drives how this works in a particular case, whether it's birth certificate or marriage certificate that needs to go to a Ethereum blockchain managed by Utah, or whether this is a scientific paper with a scientific data set that needs to be verified, distributed by verifying some hashing on the blockchain. It's just going to be different in each case, which actually I think tied to, I'm sorry, I'm taking too much time, to our earlier point yesterday. I think the word about use cases, I think use cases are really important to drive the adoption of blockchain in today's landscape, if you will.
Thank you. George?
This time it's different, is my answer, really. What have we been trying to do differently for the whole of humanity? We've been trying to achieve like privacy and freedom for every individual. This time with the blockchain, it's different, right? We've digitized the whole of humanity. The fourth industrial revolution has happened. How can we guarantee privacy and data integrity? We have to use the blockchain. That's the simple answer. This is the answer to that age-old question about how we, well, it's now an age-old question, but how we can preserve privacy and freedom for every individual. We have to use the blockchain. This time, it is different. It's not the World Wide Web. It's not Web 2. It's not church. It's not government. This time, it has to be the blockchain which we use.
Totally agree. Innovation is actually what's going to normalize it. Now, the reality is how we imply that innovation or technology is going to make it, are we free or are we going to be controlled even more? Because if this goes down a path where we actually leverage blockchain, we can actually enslave ourselves even more. For instance, these 4 countries that have, Ecuador is only one of 4 countries that has adopted Bitcoin as its standard currency. But what they then figure out is Bitcoin takes about 10 minutes to actually do full settlement. So they have to use a Lightning network on top of it, which actually says, hey, this is going to go from this source to this source, consummate it. You know who owns the Lightning network? Visa. Do you know who owns Visa? The banking industry. Do you know who owns the banking industry? My point is you keep digging into this. Either we're going to centralize decentralization, or we need to truly decentralize it. If we do not truly decentralize it, we think that we have invasions today of our privacy and our identity and information. We will be enslaved for future generations like we can never imagine. That difference that he talks about is absolutely true and correct. Innovation is what is different. The last World War that was fought, these same principles were realized, but they didn't have innovation to come out of it. We do now. And you talk about Germany, they care about privacy more than most other parts of the world. They wonder why. Privacy is a massive part of how we as humans can actually come together and make a difference. But the underlying point that I want to really make is when we actually go down this path, will we take a road that's centralizing decentralization, or will we take a path that's actually decentralizing it truly where there's no central system?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm reminded, as you spoke of that, I was reminded of a quote from Ronald Reagan that says that freedom is not preserved for a select few, but it is the divine right of all of God's children. And what Ronald Reagan meant when he said that was that just because you were born in the United States doesn't mean that we have a right to freedom, but maybe someone like George, who was born in the UK, or my son in the back, who was born in Canada, they weren't born in the United States, so they don't get freedom. No, as a person, Ronald Reagan believed that all individuals deserve freedom, and I interpret that today as to mean sovereignty, regardless of where they're born. This is a global issue. So we now only have about 30 seconds each, but can you just tell us what one thing we can do as individuals to help preserve freedom for all of God's children in the world? Michael, we'll start with you. 30 seconds.
So read this declaration. If you agree with it, sign it. You'll actually be able to cryptographically sign it. Become a member. Join. I mean, if you've got an Android phone, you'll be able to download an app called Digital Life, and you'll be able to log into what everybody's talking about with Web3. You can create a decentralized business. You can create a decentralized organization. You can create a decentralized asset. You can start living in this digital world that's decentralized today. So just learn about it. Start using it. Let's stop talking and let's start doing. So the digitalworld.earth is where you can read it. That's your action item.
Yeah, so stop talking, start doing. I love that. George?
I'd say educate and be humble. And I think that 20 seconds on each of those. Education, the fact that everyone's here, the fact that we're even in this room is a great testament to the strength of our industry, and the fact that we can continue to grow and we continue to need to educate our governments and individuals and businesses about this. I think that that's hugely inspiring, and like something that I try and do on a daily basis is informing the media, informing the wider world about the crypto industry. And be humble, because there's a huge amount, there was, when blockchain was started, kind of like an elitism to it, a kind of club. It was the blockchain club, right? And you kind of had to be in the blockchain club. Let's bring down those barriers. Let's allow for people to become part of our ecosystem. It's only going to be by involving people that we can get broader adoption, right? And that's kind of the critical aspect here. We need to make sure that we're bringing everybody into the fold.
Perfect. All right, Wen?
So realizing your decision has consequences. I think earlier point Michael made about the two phones here, right? We're not willing to give up our information for nothing. We're giving them for convenience. People don't realize that when they click on that agree button, right? So you have to understand that what you're doing, and that's a choice that you're willing to make. You're sacrificing that, and we make choices every day about, I'm giving up privacy for security at airport, right? Those are kind of trade-offs you're making, and just be educated, as George was saying, understanding, what decision you're making and making them intelligently, and that's, I think, the far more important than just clicking on that I agree button and be with it.
I think that was great. So great advice. I'll just recap it real quick. Michael said stop talking and start doing. George, educate, which I can't agree with more. Absolutely, we need to educate people and to be humble. And from Wen, it is actions have consequences. Know what the consequences are when you click that I agree button. With that, we're going to wrap up our data and document integrity panel. I think George actually said it best when he said blockchain is the way moving forward. This is the future. This is how we preserve freedom. This is how we preserve sovereignty. And this is how we maintain data integrity for generations to come. With that, I want to thank you for putting up with my daughter coming up here. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.